It began with a door that did not feel made for us. I remember standing in front of the Pantheon in Rome, trying to take it in the way tourists do, trying to admire it, photograph it, move on. But the longer I stood there, the less it looked like an entrance, and the more it looked like a statement. Britannica says the bronze double doors are about 24 feet high. In American terms, that is about the height of a two-story house. And suddenly the question was not about beauty. It was about proportion. Because a normal doorway disappears into daily life, you use it without thinking. This one refuses that. It forces a comparison between the structure and the body standing in front of it. Historical data suggests many European men in the 19th century averaged well below modern height, often somewhere around 5.5 feet or less depending on place and period. Set that body against a door this tall, and the body stops looking central. It starts looking secondary. Of course, there are safe explanations. Monumental architecture, ceremony, empire, religion. I know all of that. But none of it removes the feeling I had standing there. This does not look like a door designed around ordinary movement. It looks like the leftover edge of a world built to make human beings feel smaller than they were supposed to feel. The second I started marking these places on a map, the story changed. Before that, I still had an escape route. I could tell myself Rome was Rome. Of course, the Pantheon would be oversized. Of course, one of the most famous structures in the ancient world would speak in a language of scale and domination. Britannica even states it plainly. Huge bronze double doors, about 24 feet high, a single example, no matter how unsettling, can still be dismissed as exceptional. But then I kept going. Rome, Vatican, Florence. That is not a scatter of random dots. That is a corridor of old authority, a chain of places studied by historians, photographed by tourists, catalogued by institutions, and walked by millions. The very last places where you would expect some obvious architectural pattern to slip past unnoticed. At St. Peter's Basilica, the atrium is entered through 5 doors, and 3 of those are described as around 14 meters high and 7.6 meters wide. That works out to about 46 feet high and 25 feet wide. Once again, the doorway is not scaled to comfort. It is scaled to overwhelm. Florence added something stranger. The baptistry of San Giovanni showed me that in these old centers, a door was never just a door. The gates of paradise became a city-level artistic object, a sacred surface, something invested with civic pride and religious gravity far beyond ordinary function. That is when the map stopped looking like notes. It started looking like a file. Because these thresholds are not hiding in forgotten ruins, they are standing in full view, right in the middle of the best documented places in Europe. And somehow that makes them harder to explain, not easier. The fair thing to do here is to let the official explanation speak first. And to be honest, it makes sense up to a point. Nobody in architectural history is pretending these giant doors are random. The standard explanation is that monumental entrances were designed to project power, support ceremony, and reduce the human body before something larger, whether that was divine authority, political authority, or civic authority. In that framework, the Pantheon, St. Peter's Basilica, and the Florence Baptistery all fit cleanly. They are major religious and ceremonial spaces. A large entrance is exactly what you would expect. So I accepted that first. But then I looked closer. And the answer started feeling correct without feeling complete. Take the Pantheon. Britannica does not just mention a grand entrance. It describes huge bronze double doors about 24 feet high and identifies them as the earliest known large examples of this type. Britannica's separate entry on doors explains that Roman bronze doors were solid, mounted on pivots, and engineered into the threshold and lintel. In other words, this was not surface theater. This was a functioning, load-bearing architectural object made to endure. That distinction matters, because if something is only symbolic, there are easier ways to stage symbolism than building an enormous working threshold in heavy bronze. The same tension appears again at St. Peter's, where the 3 larger atrium doors are described as about 46 feet high and 25 feet wide. That is not just impressive. That is a scale so extreme it begins to feel less like a doorway and more like a formal zone of passage. And Florence adds another layer. The gates of paradise were treated not as a minor detail, but as a major artistic and civic commission in their own right. So, no, I do not think official history is wrong. I think it explains the meaning of these doors better than it explains the level of practical and material emphasis placed on them, as if the threshold itself once carried a deeper role than symbolism alone can fully account for. I could have dismissed one giant doorway. What I could not dismiss was the fact that the doorway always seemed to belong exactly where it was. That changed everything. Because once I stepped back from the doors and looked at the buildings themselves, the pattern became harder to escape. These entrances were not oversized mistakes. They were scaled to match entire structures built far beyond ordinary human comfort. Deep entrance porches, massive columns, wide facades, cavernous interiors, long ceremonial approaches. The doors were only one piece of a larger language. The Pantheon is the clearest example. A door about 24 feet high already feels unnatural. But then you enter a rotunda that rises to about 142 feet, with a diameter that nearly matches its height. That kind of proportion does something psychological. It makes the building feel complete in a way that is hard to describe, almost like the whole space was designed to swallow the person standing inside it. The door no longer feels too big. It feels correctly scaled to a world that is already too large. St. Peter's pushed that feeling even further. Those enormous atrium doors do not stand awkwardly against the building. They fit the portico, and the portico fits the facade. The facade itself stretches so wide and so high that the doors seem less like exaggerations and more like necessary parts of the visual order. That is what stayed with me. The scale is consistent. The doors match the walls match the columns match the void above your head. So by this point, I was no longer asking why they made certain doors monumental. I was asking why they kept repeating an entire architectural system designed to make the human figure look small on purpose. This is where the investigation becomes dangerous. Not because the evidence suddenly changes, but because the human mind does what it always does when scale stops making sense. It tries to restore the world by finding a body that fits it. That is the moment the giant hypothesis enters. Not as a proven conclusion. Not even as a formal theory at first. More like a reflex. You stand in front of the Pantheon's bronze doors, about 24 feet high, and the first instinct is almost embarrassingly direct. That cannot be for people like us. Then you look at St. Peter's, where 3 of the larger atrium doors are described at about 46 feet high and 25 feet wide, and the instinct comes back even harder. Add to that the fact that many European men in earlier centuries averaged somewhere in the 5-foot range, depending on the country and birth decade, and the emotional arithmetic practically writes itself. Door too big. User must have been bigger. I think pretending that thought never occurs would make this investigation less honest, not more. But honesty cuts both ways, because once the thought appears, it has to meet the evidence, and this is where the ground becomes firmer again. There is no accepted mainstream archaeological record showing a giant human builder class behind these monuments. The modern mythology around giant skeletons has been fed by doctored images, viral rumors, and fabricated stories. Smithsonian has directly addressed the claim that it hid giant remains and says the story came from satire, not fact. National Geographic likewise reported that one of the most circulated giant skeleton images was a hoax. So I do not think the responsible move is to declare that giants built Rome. The responsible move is harder than that. It is to sit inside the discomfort and ask why the giant idea keeps returning anyway, why it feels so natural, why it solves the visual problem so quickly, and why, even after you reject it as unproven, the original problem remains standing right in front of you. Because if these doors were not made for giant bodies, then what accounts for the scale? Pure symbolism is one answer. Ritual is another. Power is another. All of those explanations deserve respect, but none of them fully dissolve the practical strangeness of making the threshold itself so colossal, so permanent, so central. That is why another possibility begins to open. Maybe what we are seeing is not evidence of another kind of human, but evidence of inherited architecture. Spaces built according to an older standard, then reinterpreted by later ages that preserve the forms but change the story around them. That idea is less dramatic than giants, and maybe that is exactly why it bothers me more, because it suggests not a fantasy species, but a break in memory. I am not saying I believe in giants. I am saying I understand why the question keeps coming back. Even after you tell it no, somewhere along the way, the doors stopped feeling like architectural details and started feeling like survivors. That is the only word I have for it. Survivors. because the more I compared these places, the less they felt like buildings that had been fully invented by the eras that later claimed them, and the more they felt like forms carried forward, repurposed, renamed, and absorbed into newer systems of meaning. The facts themselves stay the same. The Pantheon still has huge bronze double doors about 24 feet high. Its interior height still rises to about 142 feet, nearly equal to the diameter of the space. St. Peter's still presents 5 monumental bronze doors at the portico, with the 3 larger atrium doors described at about 14 meters high and 7.6 meters wide, while the portico itself stretches about 71 meters long, 13 meters wide, and 20 meters high. Florence still gives us the gates of paradise, a door elevated into a major civic and sacred artwork. None of that changes. What changes is the feeling of what those facts might mean when placed side by side, because 3 places in different contexts keep producing the same impression. The threshold matters too much. It is too emphasized, too invested in, too central to the emotional experience of the structure to feel merely secondary. And once that became clear, I found myself asking a different kind of question. Not what function these doors served, but who first thought in these proportions, who set the scale, who made the doorway into something almost equal in importance to the building itself. The deeper I looked, the more I felt a possibility I could not prove but could no longer ignore. Maybe many later civilizations did not originate this language so much as inherit it. Maybe they walked into an older grammar of building and learned to speak inside it without fully remembering where it came from. That is where the outer edges of the conversation begin. Spend enough time in side channels, architectural rabbit holes, and communities drawn to old world anomalies, and eventually a familiar suspicion starts appearing, not as a finished theory, but as a direction of doubt, that perhaps some of what we call by modern names belongs to a deeper layer of continuity. A world renamed instead of fully understood. A legacy system covered by later theology, later state power, later artistic narratives. I am not presenting that as confirmed history. I am only saying this is the point where the idea begins to make emotional sense to people. And the door is always the piece that pushes them there, because a giant dome can stay abstract. A vast plaza can remain ceremonial. But a door is intimate. A door is the measure of entry. It is the one place where architecture has to declare what body it expects. So the question was no longer small anymore, not why these doors are oversized. What kind of inherited world leaves behind thresholds that still feel larger than the people now living among them? I do not think this investigation ends with certainty. It ends with resistance. Because even after all the checking, all the official explanations, all the caution, one thing refuses to move. The scale is still there. Harder than theory, harder than opinion, harder than comfort. I cannot prove these doors were built for giants. I cannot prove they were inherited from a civilization erased and renamed. I cannot prove that the people who used them later understood them any less than we do now. But I cannot unsee the pattern either. The buildings are real. The sites are real. Rome, Vatican City, Florence. Not fringe ruins, not half-forgotten corners. The measurements are real too. The Pantheon still stands with bronze doors about 24 feet high. St. Peter's still presents thresholds described at roughly 46 feet high and 25 feet wide. These are stubborn facts, and the emotional clue is just as stubborn. Historical height data suggests many men in the earlier European populations stood somewhere around the mid-5-foot range. Place that body in front of those entrances and the effect is immediate. This does not feel like ordinary use. It feels like architecture designed to make the human frame seem small the moment it arrives. That is why the question survives. A 24-foot bronze door in Rome, a 46-foot threshold in Vatican City, Florence treating a doorway as if it were worthy of civic reverence all by itself. Those numbers stay solid even when the explanation shifts around them. So maybe the truth is not hidden in some sealed chamber beneath the ground. Maybe it is standing in plain sight, in the most photographed places on Earth, so familiar that we stopped letting ourselves feel how strange it actually is. And maybe that is why it matters. Because not every historical mystery begins with what was concealed. Some begin with what was shown openly for so long that nobody thought to question it anymore. If you have ever felt that quiet shock in front of an old structure, do not ignore it. That is how these investigations start. Not with certainty, with proportion,